Okay, this is me mixing up 100 milliliters of a 1% stock solution of Procam dye reddish brown number 507. So I've got my box wetted down, got my scale, I'm turning it on. I'm trying to work inside the box. And I'm going to put dye powder in there until it says 1 gram. Okay, that was 1.1, so it's a little much. One gram. Okay, I'm going to take this spoon and immediately put it in a bowl of water. Put the lid on, move that away. You can see here the spoon floating in the water. Whoops. Okay, so now I've got boiling water. I filled my syringe with hot water, 50 milliliters, and I'm squirting it in there. Just trying to make a little slurry. I have a little pestle here I sometimes use to get it to go into solution. And then adding more water. I should turn off the scale. So right now it's pretty safe. It's all in the water. I don't see any dye particles floating around. So I could add a little more water here and clean off my pestle. Then pour this into the jar. Then what I usually do, which is kind of tricky here filming, is I squirt that water into the little jar, dissolving any dye particles. Then just simply add the rest of the water. So that's half of the water. I'll fill it up to the 50 mark. I find this quicker and easier than trying to measure in a measuring cup. Put the lid on. Looks like I spilled a little bit here. And that is 100 milliliters of 1% stock solution of red brown. Okay, here is the 1% stock solution for a red brown. I'm going to take 10 milliliters of this and add it to 90 milliliters of water, and that will reduce it from 1% stock solution to a 0.1% stock solution. So here we go. Use a plastic syringe, give a little stir, and pull up until I have 10 milliliters. Okay, so I have 10 milliliters here in the plastic syringe, and I'm adding it to 90 milliliters of water. I'm going to dump this into a bowl of water, put on the lid for the 1%. Okay, I'm through with that. Set that aside. Now, I have 100 milliliters of 0.1% stock solution. But I want to make extremely pale shades, so I'm going to go and dilute it to 0.01% stock solution. So I do the same thing. I take that mixed solution, and then I take 10 milliliters of that, okay, and I add it to 90 milliliters of water. You can already see it's diluted. And put the right lid on the right jar. Give that a swish, and I have a very weak concentration of stock solution to dye with. Okay, I just showed you how to mix going from a 1% stock solution of red brown. I took 10 milliliters of that and added it to 90 milliliters of water, and I got a 0.1%. Then I took 10 milliliters of that and added to 90 milliliters of water, and I got a 0.01%. So why did I do that? If I was dyeing a large amount of yarn, I would not need to do that. But to measure tiny quantities of dye stock with the equipment that I have, I need to dilute the dye stock so that I can use more of it to measure with and get a more accurate color. If I had lots of room for lots of dyed yarn that didn't turn out well, I would dye the 100, I might dye the 100 gram quantities. But I stick with the 10 gram quantities because I don't have the confidence of knowing what my color might turn out. I'm getting better, but I'm not quite there. So my goal is to dye some very pale shades of this red-brown for skin tones. So there's different amounts of melanin in the skin, and I want a range of people's skin tones. So I'm working with 10 grams. I'm choosing to do 3 shades of red-brown. One is a 0.1, one is a 0.025, and one is a 0.0125. Okay, so if you look on this chart, I have, let's see, I'm starting with 0.1. Well, I guess I'm doing a 0.1, and then I'm jumping down to 0.025, and then I'm going to do one half as strong as that, 0.0125. So I got a new chart here. So if I was working with the 1% stock solution, and 10 grams of yarn, I would need to measure 1.25 milliliters and 2.5 milliliters. That's a little small. I can do 2.5, but I can't do 1/4 of a milliliter. My eye and my measuring tools just aren't that accurate. So I want to make that 10 times, I want to move my decimal point by 10 to get a bigger number to measure. So I just diluted the dye. So now it's a 0.01%, and instead of 1.25, I move the decimal point to one spot, and I'm measuring 12.5 milliliters to get one shade, and 25 milliliters to get a shade darker. So that's the reason I'm diluting. If you're dyeing large quantities of yarn, this is not a step you need to worry with. Okay, now I'm going to add some dye to my little jars or dye pots. I've got my notes here. Jar 1, formula. Jar 2, formula. This is my stock solution. I can tell by looking at the label, which is written on the jar and the lid. The strength is 0.1%, and it's a mixture of half azure blue and half grasshopper. So, jar number 1 is going to be the paler shade. It gets 5 milliliters. Jar number 2 is it's deeper, next shade deeper. It's 10 milliliters of this dye stock solution. And if you remember, the jars have a 1/4 teaspoon of salt and enough water to make 300 milliliters total after I've added my dye. So if I'm adding 5 milliliters of dye, that means this has 295 milliliters of water. This 10 milliliters of dye stock goes in, so there's 290 milliliters of water. I'm going to start by putting the syringe in the dye stock solution. pulling the plunger and getting 5 milliliters of dye. And I got it, I think. Okay, so I'm just going to squirt that in here. Make sure you stir it nice so it's all in solution. And then I'm going to double that, putting 10 in the jar beside it. Okay, I'm putting my syringe in a bowl of water so I don't make a mess with it. Screwing on the lid and setting it aside. Make sure you stir that real nice. Now I've got my skein of yarn. It's marked 0.1%, which is the same depth of shade on my little note here, 0.1%. I'm squeezing it out. If it's skeined, I'm untwisting it so I have a nice loose skein, and it goes in, gets stirred a little bit, and then set aside. Now I'm going to do the same for the other one. Verifying I got the right formula, 0.05% depth of shade, that's your key number, depth of shade 0.05%. Loosening it up a little bit, putting it in and stirring it. So now these are all ready to be set with the heat. I'll set that aside and do the rest of my jars.